Let me.
Great. All right. All right. Well, thank you, Jamie, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. As Jamie said, my name is Simon Hedges. I've been working in wildlife conservation for just over 30 years. Most of that time working on large mammals, much of it on elephants. I spent the last 18 years working and directing WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society's elephant conservation program. I left WCS in January of this year to set up a new NGO, which I'll mention very briefly in a moment. Before we actually kick off with the substance of the webinar, I was asked to give a brief introduction to myself, give you a little bit of background on my experience. So one of the key things I've spent much of my life doing is helping to improve ways of monitoring elephant populations and other large mammal populations. I'm sure we will appreciate that monitoring is very important for wildlife conservation, so we can tell whether we're being successful or not in our aims to conserve species. So I spend quite a lot of time developing new methods and published a couple of books, manuals on the subject, which are available free of charge from the sources you can see on the screen here. I was also part of the CITES MIC technical advisory group that helped test the proportion of illegally killed elephants, the PIKE index, which is used by CITES to track elephant poaching trends and inform trade policy. And I've worked quite a lot on human-wildlife conflict, particularly human-elephant conflict. You can see on the screen here one of the examples of our work in Indonesia. This one a successful example of reducing elephant conflict around the national park there. And I mention these things because I want to make clear that I'm coming to this webinar and to the subject of conservation planning very much from a conservation practitioner's point of view, not an academic point of view or a professional planner's point of view, even though I have spent quite a lot of the last 10 years on conservation planning methodology. Indeed, I was part of a team of people, a group of people that asked the question, what do we really mean when we're saying we're saving a species, recognizing that avoiding extinction is not enough and calling for greater ambition. It was a paper we published about 10 years ago now in Bioscience, posing that question. You can see it on the top left of the screen, hopefully. And I was also part of the IUCN Species Conservation Planning Task Force that Bob Lacey, the former chair of the Captive Breeding Specialist Group, chaired. That was set up by Holly Dublin. I'll talk a bit more about that when we get into the main part of the webinar. And the guidelines for species conservation planning are available from the SSC website. There have been a couple of successor documents now building on that handbook, making it more applicable to groups other than the large mammals, which was one of the criticisms of the first edition. But it's also informed a guideline, a handbook, on the guidelines and standards for developing national elephant action plans, which is now in its third edition, which I developed for the Elephant Protection Initiative. I'll talk a bit more about that in the main part of the webinar. And those same thoughts about how we should think about conserving species have informed the new green list of species that IUCN is developing. It's a recent paper from a number of us at the bottom of the screen. And critically, for the purposes of what we're talking about today, these thoughts and recommendations coming out of these planning development processes and the handbooks and manuals which have resulted have informed a number of elephant action plans and other species action plans. I'm most familiar with the elephant ones, so I'm going to be talking about a number of elephant action plans we've developed and the lessons learned from them, including the one you can see at the top right of the screen, the elephant action plan, conservation action plan, the MECAP from Myanmar. I also mentioned very briefly just now that I left WCS in January to form a new NGO, which we're calling Asian Arcs, which is hoping to emulate some of the successes of African parks, the NGO working in Africa, directly managing protected areas in partnerships with governments. We're just in the process of setting that up in Asia. I'm happy to talk about that privately if other people are interested in that. But I think that's probably enough of an introduction to myself. So I will now switch PowerPoints and get into the main part of the webinar. So what I've been asked to talk about, as I'm sure you understand and know already, is from planning to implementation, including governance and decision making, based particularly on my experience of developing elephant action plans for a number of countries across Asia and Africa. And one of the key questions that Jamie asked me to talk about were, what are the barriers to implementation that can occur following the planning process? And I think it's important to recognise that actually those barriers are rooted in the planning process and in how the planning process is designed from the very start. One of the key things that has become clear over the last number of years is it's absolutely vital to ensure all the relevant stakeholders participate in the conservation planning process, the action plan development process from the very beginning. That might seem obvious, it's certainly common sense, isn't it? But for a long time, that wasn't really the case. Many action plans were developed without that kind of broad stakeholder engagement. And a number of people, including Phil McGowan and Richard Fuller and some others back in the late 90s and early 2000s, reviewed the success of the IUCN species action plans, the so-called white and black books that I'm sure you're familiar with, to see how they were actually contributing or not to conservation outcomes. And one of the rather depressing conclusions from that review process was that many of the action plans were great sources of information about the species, biology, behavior, ecology, and so on. Great resources to go to find out about the distribution and status of the species. But the actual action which resulted on the ground was often not really happening. There was very limited action in many cases. And one of the conclusions drawn from the review was that the main problem seemed to be that these action plans were often developed by one or two experts, essentially sitting in their studies, their libraries, writing a very detailed treatise on the biology and status of the species, and then a wish list for what they thought should be done to save the species, conserve the species. But then those action plans gathered dust in government offices and in university libraries and so on, because there hadn't been that sense of ownership and buy-in from as a fairly major limitation of those early years. The chair of the Species Survival Commission, she convened a task force I mentioned briefly earlier, convened and chaired by Bob Lacey. I was part of that along with a number of other people, and space of about 2 years, I believe, culminating in the publication of this Strategic Planning for Species Conservation Handbook in 2008. One of the key recommendations from that process was to engage with as many stakeholders as possible from the very beginning of the planning process, to foment the idea of ownership amongst government agencies and to get buy-in from all the NGOs and other civil society organisations that were working to conserve species. And that's, I think, one of the most important recommendations coming out of that whole review process. And so we used that handbook to guide approach to elephant conservation planning in Malaysia, for example, where we worked with the Malaysian government to develop this National Elephant Conservation Action Plan, which is known as the NECAP. There was a small team of us who were the main editorial committee and conveners of the process. You can see DWNP as the Department of Wildlife and National Parks of the Malaysian government. They were key players. WCS was heavily involved, as was the University of Nottingham. But the real key thing, this was just the editorial and convening committee. The real key thing of the process, the key aspect of the process, was to convene a number of workshops where government agencies were represented, stakeholders, including local community representatives, were included in the development of the action plan for the elephants in Peninsular Malaysia. We had a number of workshops starting in September 2012, several other smaller meetings and workshops to work on particular aspects of the action plan, culminating in the official launch of the action plan. The official launch of the action plan in late 2013. But the government of Malaysia actually went on beyond the launch to seek further consultation, recognising even though we'd had a number of workshops to seek inputs from a whole wide range of stakeholders, that not everyone who had a stake in elephant conservation and the implications of that conservation plan could be at every meeting. And so the government did a tour of the Peninsula Malaysia, meeting with a whole range of government and other agencies to what they call socialise the action plan, get comments from stakeholders from the communities right up to government officials. This is a slide actually from the Malaysian government, a PowerPoint given by them, but it was actually in PDF format, so I couldn't edit it. So the English is slightly odd in places, but the key thing is you can see a list of the agencies and other people who were consulted. And there were a number of meetings held throughout the different states in the peninsula. As most of you know, I'm sure, Malaysia is a federal government system with the federal government, and then each of the states having its own government too. And so each of those state governments was consulted, and the comments on the action plan were fed back into the process as the plan continues to evolve. And this is one of the other points I'll come to later, is one of the other keys to implementing an action plan is to keep it as a living document. And so even though the plan had been published by the time that most of these meetings have been held, because the plan is being seen as a living document, inputs from these stakeholders fed into the process. This was the conclusion of a presentation that the government of Malaysia actually gave to the government of Myanmar and NGOs working on conservation of elephants in Myanmar, to present some of the lessons learned from the process in Malaysia and essentially recommend it as a process to the government of Myanmar. Again, this is a slide from the government. They're emphasising very much the need for a participatory process to help keep the action plan in line with government policies and maximise the chance of implementation, because it has that government buy-in. So the government of Myanmar was very receptive to that approach, and it asked us, again, I was working with WCS at that point, to help them develop a action plan for the conservation of elephants in Myanmar, which is called the MECAP. When they asked us, as I say, I was working with WCS, basically it's no use just the government sitting down with WCS. We need all of the other NGOs working on elephants in Myanmar to be involved too, and representatives of the various other agencies, and they agreed to that. And so we convened 4 multi-stakeholder workshops over the course of about 2.5 years to develop the action plan for elephants in Myanmar. I think it's one of the key points coming out of this is that the implications of the multi-stakeholder approach to conservation planning do include the cost and time requirements for hosting multiple workshops. And it's obviously easier for species which it's easy to raise money, or relatively easy to raise money for, such as elephants. Not so easy for many other species, and I do appreciate that. And I think perhaps for some species it won't be possible to have a whole series of workshops. It might be necessary only to have one, in which case you have to think very carefully about who's invited, try and get the biggest breadth of expertise as well as representation from the relevant stakeholders. Obviously is a challenge. One of the other key lessons learned from the whole process is that it's essential to have a really detailed action plan with a lot of detail about the actions, who's going to do them, the timelines for actually implementing them, so on. And many of the previous set of white and black book action plans from IUCN are very vague about the actions. As I said, there's a lot of detail about the species and its status, but not a great deal of detail about how to actually implement the particular conservation project which are recommended. And so one of the things that we've recommended in the National Elephant Action Plan guidelines and handbook standards handbook I mentioned earlier on, is to have separate species conservation implementation plans as annexes to the main document. So, for example, that Elephant Action Plan from Myanmar is a 10-year document, essentially a fairly high-level strategy saying what needs to be done in the country to save elephants. But, for example, under the human-elephant conflict chapter, it will say things like work with industry to develop a pays approach to mitigating human-elephant conflict, which is, a sensible recommendation. But the detail actually how to do that is not in that published book. The detail of how to do it is in the separate standalone annexes. And Jamie, I think, has already sent you an example of the human-elephant conflict implementation plan annex from the Myanmar action plan to show you just how much detail we're talking about. And it does look quite a difficult thing to produce, and a lot of work goes into those action plan, implementation plan annexes for sure. But if you don't have that detail, if you don't have the guidance on who's going to do what, when they're going to do it, whether there's funds available for it, and critically how it's going to be monitored and evaluated, the chances are that nothing will happen. And we'll come back to the monitoring and evaluation and the oversight processes a little bit later in this webinar. Also, having these detailed implementation plans allows you to see at a glance where the gaps are. So, for example, you'll be able to see that maybe no one is working on reducing the flow of illegal ivory through a country for an elephant action plan, so there needs to be an anti-trafficking component added, and so on. And again, by keeping these implementation plan annexes separate, it's easy to keep them updated. And therefore, the whole action plan does become a living document, even if the main published tone is not changing, and you don't want to keep obviously having to publishing new action plan documents. It's easy to keep the annexes up to date without having to interfere with the publishing process. The guidelines and standards for National Elephant Action Plans handbook, which is in the resource folder, gives a lot of detail about how to develop these implementation plans. And there's an example template. You've also got the draft from the Myanmar Elephant Action Plan for the human-elephant conflict. But one word of advice is complete those implementation plans at the workshop itself or at the workshops. It's extremely difficult post-workshop to try and work out who's going to do what and get people to commit things and work out what the timelines are. That's the essential detail is much, much easier to get from people if they're sitting around a table. So I think I've seen too many workshops where the vital part of the conversation, which is about action, takes place in the last afternoon of day 3 or something, and it's kind of squeezed out, it runs out of time. There's so much time has been spent on developing the vision and talking about the goals and all these other things, which are important. But we need to allow quite significant time to complete these implementation plans, because without them, we've found that the action plans don't actually do their job very well in most cases. I mentioned the importance of monitoring and evaluation. They, of course, are tremendously important, because although some people will talk about monitoring and counting animals as in a sort of derogatory manner and talk about counting animals for extinction and so on, that of course isn't the purpose of monitoring and evaluation. We need to know whether the species we're working on, the populations of those species we're working on, are going up, going down, are stable, because without that we don't know whether the action plan is being successful in conserving the species. So baselines and then monitoring against baselines are tremendously important. And the good news is that as a conservation community, as a scientific community, we pretty much know how to do this now for most species in most places. There are one or two aspects where there are still some challenges. For example, interpreting data from range-based patrols on encounters with threats, poachers' camps and those kind of things, snares and so on. It's still quite difficult to estimate the nature of the threat and whether the threat level is going up or down from those crude encounter rates. There's a lot of people working on that particular statistical challenge right now, and I think in the next year or so we'll have decent field-ready methods for that too. But on the whole, we know how to monitor wildlife habitat, and threats. And they should be built in as integral components into the implementation plans of any action plan for species conservation. And we should really adopt an adaptive management approach. Again, people often pay lip service to adaptive management, but we really do need to learn the lessons as we go along, feed that back into the process, identify what the issues are, if certain assumptions were flawed and therefore we're not achieving what we hope to achieve, modify the action to properly address the reality on the ground. And again, by keeping these implementation plans as separate annexes, it's actually quite easy and straightforward to make the necessary changes to encourage and facilitate the adaptive management process. And then the other really important point we've come to recognise is there is a real need for coordination. For example, a steering committee at high levels in the government, the highest level possible. For example, in the Secretariat of the Department of Wildlife and National Parks in most countries, for example, because there's a need to monitor whether the action plans are actually being implemented and take the necessary steps if they're not. There's quite a lot of guidance in the National Elephant Action Plan handbook on the composition and role of such teams. There's a recommendation in that handbook to have national elephant coordinators who check with people who are implementing different projects across the country and then feed back to a committee. The committee then meets every 6 months to review progress. That's the way, along with the buy-in from the start, to help make sure that action plans are implemented. Have someone charged in the government with the oversight of the implementation of the plan, meeting regularly and liaising with NGOs, universities, other civil society bodies who are helping the government implement the plan. I'll give you a couple of examples where we've road tested that approach. So, for example, in Malaysia, there's a coordinating body called My Gajah. Gajah is the Malaysian word for elephant, which oversees the implementation of the NECAP, the National Elephant Conservation Action Plan for Malaysia. You can see that the lead agency is DWNP, the Department of Wildlife and National Parks. And there's an advisory council and a secretariat formed of various other government departments and the NGOs, and then radiating out other people who are responsible for implementing different components who report back through the secretariat to the lead agency. And that has worked reasonably well in Malaysia. There are some challenges in Malaysia relating to the federal government system I mentioned earlier. As in any country which has a federal government and then a series of state governments, there's often tensions between the two levels of government, and what the central government might want to happen doesn't necessarily happen in every state. That's just a general problem in Malaysia for a lot of things, not specific to the implementation of the Elephant Action Plan. But we found that this oversight body works pretty well in keeping track of implementation of the Elephant Plan in Malaysia. In Myanmar, the government itself called for a government-led body to oversee the implementation of the Elephant Action Plan. And in their case, they wanted the actual committee to be only government departments, the forestry departments, the Myanmar Timber Enterprise, infrastructure ministries, and so on. The judiciary, police, and customs are particularly important for elephant action plans because of the need to deal with poaching and trafficking in ivory. Less important perhaps for other species which are not subject to international wildlife trade problems. And then advising the steering committee is an advisory group comprised of the NGOs who are working on elephants and universities. The plan is to have the coordination committee meet every 6 months. The day before the meeting, the advisory group reports to the committee on progress, and then the committee identifies what problems there are and makes requests for changes, and so on. Identifies needs for funding, makes requests for help with raising funds and the like. There are some challenges which have come out in Myanmar. There are several species action plans being developed or have just been developed, like the elephant one, which was published by the government, launched by the government in February of this year. And because each of them has adopted the same approach, that there was initially a call to have a coordination committee for each of the species which had an action plan. So for tigers, for elephants, for freshwater dolphins, and so on. And clearly that isn't really practical for a government to have a whole range of different coordination committees for a whole range of different species. So I think the solution we're seeing emerging, or likely to emerge in Myanmar, is to have a multi-species coordination committee which oversees groups of action plans, linked species. So for example, terrestrial large mammals, there'll be one coordination committee for those. Marine species, another committee overseeing the action plans for those species, which seems like a sensible, pragmatic approach to that challenge. So I think at that point, I'll hand over to Jamie to be the embassy or the convener of any requests for clarification, and then maybe we can go into open discussion. I'm happy to talk with you about the lessons we've learned in more detail.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. So as we've done before, if anybody has a question you want to ask, either turn your microphone on now and then I'll cue you up, or write your comment in the chat group. So Steph has brought up this point of multi-species coordination committee. Yeah, may seem sort of like a good idea in Kenya. Steph, do you want to add anything to that verbally through a microphone, or? It'd be interesting to hear why you think it might particularly work in your context. All right, right. Your mic isn't working. Okay, no problem at all. I mean, this is going into this topic of governance, which we just touch on in one of the talks in the course, and I know that you set up the governance structure to be fit for that particular context. So often it's not cut and paste. You do need to work out what's appropriate there. And sometimes you've only got a certain amount of decision making. It's not for you as a facilitator to decide, obviously, how they're going to organize themselves, but you can help to, sort of encourage them to think about clarity in how decisions are made. I just wonder, Simon, one point that I feel quite strongly about, but I'm interested to get your view on, is about the need to have key individuals identified as well as, organizations or groups of people. So we say, the judiciary will be represented, but is it important? Do you say it's important to get down to who exactly within the judiciary is that focal point who's going to be representing on the group?
Yes, no, I think that's a very good point, Jamie. Certainly for species where there's a major poaching threat or trafficking in the species or species parts, and ivory, obviously rhino horn, obviously spring to mind, pangolins, then having the highest level representation from the judiciary possible adds weight to the action plan and its recommendations. So for example, in Mozambique, when we were working with the government of Mozambique to help them develop a national elephant action plan years ago, we were fortunate that the Assistant Attorney General, so the second in command of his office, attended the workshops and showed a lot of high-level government backing for the actions related to anti-trafficking and anti-poaching and so on. So there's a balance, obviously, between getting people with relevant expertise and with relevant authority. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can only have one workshop, then you've got to balance who you can invite. But really, you want people in the government who actually, in their day jobs, are involved in the issues related to the species, if at all possible, plus people with authority, ideally in the same people.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. And just there may be somebody else who had their mic on just now? No. Okay, so just following up on what Steph was saying about in the situation in Kenya, one of the points she made is that there is a body that's already identified, the federal body that's identified as being responsible for action plans. And I was actually chatting with with Anne Baker at the moment from Amphibian Arc, and she was giving examples of an amphibian project that was developed. And then the government people were saying, well, that's all very well, but we're going to be, we've got our own process. And I do wonder, and this may be something to do with NGOs, that there's a kind of a drive to, you see a gap, you want to see things happen, so you move forward. And I think sometimes we perhaps don't recognize enough the structures that are in place already within the system, and rather than trying to replicate or do something parallel, is actually, even though you may be able to produce a better plan that way, you may do some better thinking, it might be more constructive and at least start getting stuff done if you work within the system. So rather than developing a new workshop process, kind of try and influence the existing way in which the federal body might be doing that, which is something we talked about in Brazil as well when I was there recently.
Right, I think that's a very, very good observation, and it leads me to something I've often said when I've been helping setting up action planning workshops for various species, many elephants, but some other species, with NGOs and governments in different countries. I think a key point is that we shouldn't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. There's no question that any of us probably could sit down in our offices and write a much better action plan than comes out of your typical multi-stakeholder workshop, but it won't get implemented. So what's in a sense, what's the point? Obviously, there are compromises necessary when you have multiple stakeholders developing an action plan for anything. But the payoff, and I strongly believe that the pros outweigh the cons in this regard, is you're much more likely to get the sense of ownership from the government, or at least participation from the government, and approvals to do different things, to be really pragmatic, than if it's just developed by one NGO or a few individuals. And so I think we have to recognise that the plan won't be perfect. There will be certain aspects which might not be to our liking, and they perhaps can be improved over the course of time, especially as we keep in mind the living document aspect of particularly the implementation plans. It's not a we finished it, it's now done, it can't be revisited process. The whole idea is to keep the thing alive, and as each review process takes place every 6 months or whatever is agreed, there are opportunities to improve things which weren't perhaps as good as they could have been in the first iteration. So we should keep that in mind too. But the whole point of an action plan, of course, is to lead to implementation on the ground. And the example you mentioned, I'm not familiar with, but you mentioned an NGO developing a plan and the government said, well, we've got our own process. Well, that's the worst possible outcome, isn't it, really? There's no point in an NGO developing a plan if the government is not even going to consider it because it's got its own process. That there has to be a meeting of people, both a meeting of minds and ideally a physical meeting to agree on what the process. And if the government's already got a process, then the NGO should be making light recommendations for how it might be improved, for example, but not ignoring it and developing their own plan.
And actually, yeah, Vicky's picking up on that as well and talking about this being the case for invertebrates and plants as well. And actually, it might be because there are processes in place, or as Steph is identifying, it's all very well for you, Simon, because you're working with elephants. Not that she said it like this, it's me saying it. As you pointed out, you're working with an iconic species, and so it might be a bit easier to get the resources together to do it. And although this goes beyond facilitation, I've been thinking about kind of IUCN and the different specialist groups, and to what extent do we miss opportunities to piggyback certain planning onto the back of other planning where there may be funding, or at least we're able to share costs. And I feel like there's sort of generally a movement towards this more kind of multi-species approach, which I think all the stuff we're talking about in this course, and the getting levels of agreement and thinking about depths of thinking, they're still applicable, but we may be moving more to, there will always be a case for a single species because they need that level of detail, but increasingly for a variety of reasons, we're going to have to work out processes that allow us to plan for multiple species.
Yeah, absolutely. And another sort of related thought comes to mind on that. I mean, I have worked on other species apart from elephants, so I do recognise that it's in many ways easier to develop plans for the iconic species where there's more resources. Though equally, there are many more egos in the room, and typically too, a lot more arguments, and often these species are quite politicised, arguments over whether there should be legal trade and so on. So it's with the advantages of greater resources often come some other challenges. I have worked on other species, much less charismatic species, where it's harder to get the resources. Wild cattle, for example, in Asia, which are often dismissed as just being cows by sort of flippant manner, it's hard to raise money for saving those, for example. But the other real lesson, I think, which has come out of these workshops, and this is regardless whether it's elephants or plants or anything else, I believe, is obviously it's important for the action plans to be informed by the best available data on the species distribution and status. And quite a few workshops I've been to for a variety of species aim to do that status assessment, status review in the workshop itself. I can see why it's done that way, but it often takes a tremendous amount of time in the workshop process to do that review, time which I would argue would be much better spent working out what the actions are and getting buy-in for those actions. So if at all possible, we've tried to promote this in the work we've done, is identify some people who can do the status review beforehand, bring it to the meeting and get a more or less complete review assessed and reviewed at the meeting. That's a much quicker, more efficient process. It allows much more time in the workshop to be spent talking about what the objectives are and what the actions are going to be, rather than whether there's a population of whatever it is still left in this particular block of forest or whatever.
Thanks, Simon. And others, if you've got any questions, do put your microphones on. And I was going to just to the point that's been going on in the chat room. There's this trade-off, and as a facilitator, you spend your whole time kind of trying to balancing up different elements and what might be the most helpful thing to do at this point. So, as you say, we may be able to do a better plan, we may be able to do higher quality thinking, but if we haven't got enough agreement, then nothing's going to happen. But we don't want to just have agreement over a rubbish plan. So,
no, of course not.
That's helpful. So you have the facilitator is trying to think about, no matter how well you plan the event, you want to be responsive to how people are responding to the process, and sometimes thinking about suggesting a different tool that might allow for, maybe it's not as deep thinking, but allows you to get better agreement at that point. And at other points, you might be saying, or the group needs to think into this issue more, so we're going to apply another tool that allows you to dig that bit deeper. And that responding to the working group and being able to flex a bit is something that is I think it is a skill that effective facilitators need to kind of develop. It's not a bit like you don't just develop a plan and stick to that plan for 5 years, you're going to review it. Same thing is going to happen within a workshop.
Yeah, absolutely. And good facilitation is critical to development of a decent plan. So give a lot of thought, I'm sure you know this already, give a lot of thought to who you ask to facilitate the workshop.
Thanks, Simon. Vicky's just saying green listing was mentioned at the beginning. Is there an overlap between conservation planning and green listing?
Yes, I believe there really is. I think it came from that whole question of what do we mean by saving a species, that was posed by a bunch of people, including me, about 10 years ago in a series of papers. And the kind of answers which come up are having things like representative populations in different habitat types across the range of the species. If there's subspecies, making sure that all the subspecies are included in priority areas and those kind of things. Looking at having ecologically functional population sizes, not just trying to avoid extinction. Having animals doing or plants doing the things they're supposed to be doing. And so in that, certainly in their first edition of the IUCN Species Conservation Planning Guidelines Handbook, that same thinking of challenging the people who are developing the action plan to think, what do we actually mean by saving the species in question, or the group of species in question? How many do we want? How many places do we want them in? What kind of numbers do we need in each population? They're the kinds of questions that should be posed, and we've explicitly posed it in certain workshops. What does success look like if we're being ambitious for the species and not just trying to avoid extinction? And the green list builds on that, because the red list, of course, is all about the risk of the extinction for different species. The green list goes beyond that to say, what does conservation success look like, and how can we encourage people to be ambitious in their endeavours to conserve the species? So there's an intimate link, and it's explicitly stated certainly in the first Species Conservation Planning Handbook.
And that was a point that Caroline Lees, who did the first couple of webinars, she brought up when you're going through that visioning process, that it's only you may get nice agreement around having a viable population, and that might be good for everybody saying, yeah, I can live with that, let's go for it. But it becomes more helpful as you can drill down and say, in our context, what does that mean for us? And things that interpretation is going to reflect your values as well, isn't it? It's not just going to be a fact about what viability looks like, because it's what you're comfortable kind of living with. Just one related point, that we had another webinar by with Phil Miller talking about PVA, and how that is one additional tool you can use to say, well, if we're talking about a viable population or a sustainable population, we may be able to dig down a bit further and say, in our book, for our species, we're saying sustainability is less than a 5% likelihood of extinction within the next 25 years. That's giving you much greater detail around what good looks like, so that when you then come to the analysis and planning strategies, etc., it actually becomes much easier to be able to visualize what you can do, because you are much clearer around what success looks like.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, sorry, Steph, you're saying, how much of this do you think applies to protected area conservation planning? I feel like smaller conservancies do not have funding for this kind of planning, are not interested in inviting comment or expertise from outside their small circle. Just before you respond to that, Simon, I just wonder if we can unpick that a bit. I think there are a couple of points in there. There's one thing around them not having the funding. So in fact, you're suggesting there's two different reasons there. It might be they're not asking it because they don't have the money to ask it, or it might be they're not asking for, or having a more detailed process because they don't want a detailed process. So there's kind of a interpretation going on there about the reasons behind why they might not kind of reach out. I don't know, Simon, whether I've just confused you further with that, or whether you have any sense of an initial response to what she's asking about, which is essentially, how whether the sort of thing we're talking about here applies to protected area or conservancy planning, smaller scale planning.
I think there's certainly overlaps. Planning for development of a management plan for a protected area, for example, again, would be better done if there are representations from the various stakeholder groups involved in the planning process, no question, right? You don't want a park management plan or a protected area management plan written just by the park ecologist, for example. And I speak as someone who's got an ecology background, so I'm very aware of the importance of ecology. But we all know, I'm sure, that one of the most important determinants of whether a protected area is going to be successful or not is the relationships with the people living in and around it. And so one has to balance the needs of the species that live in the protected area with the people's aspirations around it. And at the very least, you should be aiming for a situation where people are not losing out as a result of living next to a protected area. that human wildlife conflict isn't ruining their lives. And so, given that reality, it does make sense, I think, to bring in community voices into the development of a management plan for a protected area. And of course, that's a politically sensitive issue in many places, and it's quite challenging. And actually, I'd say it's probably more challenging in some ways than developing a species conservation action plan for a whole country. If you're focusing in on some potentially very sensitive issues at a local scale. But the general principle of involving a range of stakeholders in developing a plan, I think, still holds. And also, obviously, having a management plan with sufficient detail so we know whether it's being implemented properly or not, and frequent reviews of progress, identifying what the barriers to success have been, trying to overcome them, keeping it as a living document. I think those principles apply to areas as much as species conservation action plans for whole countries or whole ranges.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. There's Steph's just working on a question just now. I just want to check. We just got another couple of minutes, another few minutes, and does anybody else have other questions they want to raise whilst Steph is just finishing? I've just asked her a question to clarify her question. I think that just one point on essentially what we're talking around identifying governance structures, how a decision is going to be made, what's the flow of communication, what's the role of different people. This ties in with this. We talked, I think, in an earlier talk about the Beckard model, which is saying, you've got these purpose, goals, roles, processes, relationships, and often it's not a people reason why stuff doesn't happen or doesn't happen well. It's because one of those other four. And governance is, thinking about the governance, whether it's protected areas or a single species, that is trying to define the roles and also clarify the processes by which decisions be made, which makes it easier for kind of project to be able to function. Simon, did you have something you were going to add anyway?
Or, I was just going to bring up the final slide showing the bullets of sort of take-home messages from what I was saying earlier. Just put that up on the screen. I think we do have about another 10 minutes. I think. Jamie, if people want to continue talking, I'm happy to.
Absolutely.
Still have that. But this slide just shows the sort of take-home messages from what I was saying earlier on in the main part of the webinar, and also it has a link to a Dropbox that I set up with a number of resources, including the Myanmar and Malaysia elephant action plans, a couple of relevant papers, including that one by Fuller and McGowan and so on, about the action plans. A paper which actually came out a couple of weeks ago, looking at the paucity of assessments of conservation outcomes for conservation planning around the world. Still a surprising lack of data on how useful conservation planning has been, which is quite a sobering read. Jim, I think you said yesterday you might have moved some of those resources into one of the dedicated folders associated with this course, but if people needed, the Dropbox link is also on this slide.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So Steph has got that. So what she's saying is about that you've got a government agency that's a sole agency in charge of wildlife in a country, but a community is trying to conserve its wildlife, has to complete a management plan in order to be considered a community conservancy. So I think you're saying you have a situation that the process by which a community might get something established is they produce a plan and submit it to the authority. So you're suggesting that there's a separation. The community does a plan and submits it, and then the authority decides whether they're going to accept it. I'm getting myself confused as to what the question is. So it seems that such a community needs to engage with the government in the early stages. Yeah, I mean, would you say that if you've got separate stakeholder groups that have different roles and responsibilities, is it helpful feels like a bit of a kind of a sort of a truism, but is it helpful for those groups to try and work together much earlier on in the process than just at the point where they are, producing plans and trying to get them accepted by the other?
I guess it's potentially a two-way process, isn't it? But ideally, I would imagine, and this sounds like a Kenyan example to me. I'm reasonably familiar with Kenya, so it sounds like it's perhaps coming from a Kenyan context. But ideally, you would want representation from a community group who was planning to set up a conservancy at one of the workshops, developing a plan for the species or the area. But that's of course not always possible politically. The other way it potentially can work, of course, is that depending on what's in the action plan, a community developing a proposal for a conservancy could actually use the action plan as support for its case. If there's a recommendation in the action plan, for example, that there needs to be more protected habitat for the species or species group in a certain part of the country, then obviously that would, in theory, be at least a supporting statement that the conservancy or proposed conservancy group could advance in support of its case. But I think one of the key things here is to try and get people who are familiar with plans for new conservancies, for example, to have their voices heard at the planning workshops. And that ideally would be them themselves, but I suppose it could also be through supporters, NGOs or other civil society groups who might be working with the conservancy or proposed conservancy community, could voice the proposal, could describe the proposal in the planning workshop and argue that would actually make sense because it would fill a gap in the need for habitat protection for the species and so on. So there's more than one way of getting the voice heard. I would say ideally it would be directly, but it could also be through civil society groups or local government representation, getting the voice heard at the meeting. And ideally one would hope to strengthen the case when it's made to central government for approval or not.
And what you're highlighting again is this need for the pre-planning stage. And actually in this workshop these last couple of days we've been realizing through discussion that pre-planning phase, if we thought about the size of the box being reflective of what you need to do there, it's massive. There's lots of stuff that needs to go on to think about what's the most appropriate environment in which how do we set up the workshop for greater success? And in some ways it's perhaps unfair to assume that everything can happen in the workshop. There are some conversations, there's some identification of roles, there's obviously identification of processes that needs to happen in advance of it and might carry on afterwards in order to make sure that the workshop has greatest chance of success.
Absolutely, and I think going back to some of those early EVA and PHVA workshops that CPSG ran, people like Phil Miller and Uli Seal and others, what was actually a very useful approach that was adopted in those workshops, I went to quite a number of them, was to have a resource book made available to all the participants. And CPSG worked very hard to compile a lot of information from stakeholders before the workshop. It must have taken a lot of time and effort to do it. It was tremendously useful to have this handbook, quite a weighty tome in many cases of relevant papers on the status of the species, information about threats to the species and all kinds of things, examples of relevant national law covering the species in question and so on. These were tremendously helpful resources at the workshops. And if most people don't have the luxury of the time and money to do that beforehand, but if you can, that's great. And I imagine, Jamie, this is one of the roles of CPSG to sort of build on that earlier history through your earlier incarnation as CPSG. And I'd also say that the one group that had really always pushed multi-stakeholder work was CPSG. So those PVA workshops were always multi-stakeholder in my experience, and that was one of the key lessons we took from that early process and put into the ICN handbook on species conservation planning. So I think CPSG really led the way on in both compiling as much information beforehand and identifying who needed to be at the workshop, and having a range of stakeholders was definitely trailblazing, and lessons which are still very, very relevant today.
Simon, Ellie's just asking as well around tips on, I'm just checking she's not got a microphone on, I'm going to ask, but tips on keeping the document living, especially when it can get quite detailed.
Yeah, so I think the way we've approached that issue in the examples I gave in Malaysia and Myanmar and other countries I've worked in on elephants in the last few years, Malawi, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and so on, to have the one published book, which is the sort of 10-year big picture vision for what needs to be done, with the vision, the goals, the objectives, and some high-level discussion of the actions, and the background information on the status in the country and the threats and so on, because a lot of that isn't going to change dramatically over a 10-year period, and that's often published as a physical book as well as in a PDF form. Governments do like to be able to hand out hard copies of reports to donors and so on, but then the critical detail on how the implementation is going to take place is in these separate annexes. We've used just simple Excel sheets. You've got one, I think, Jamie, I'd seen you circulated like you did yesterday, the example of the Human Elephant Conflict Implementation Plan Annex from the Myanmar Elephant Conservation Plan. And those lend themselves, because they're simple Excel sheets, to easy updating. As actions are implemented, they can be removed from the list, or if they've failed for some reason, a new approach is necessary, then that could be incorporated. The old approach is taken out, the new one is put in. Timelines change as funding becomes available, and so on. As long as you've got sensible version control, then keeping those Excel implementation plan annexes up to date is quite straightforward, and particularly if you've got someone whose job it is to do that, and that's why we've pushed the idea of having a national elephant coordinator. But it could be, any other species. It doesn't have to be ideally it would be a government person. In some places we've got people then being paid directly by their salaries being supported by an NGO to help the government make the decision to allow them to spend their time on that process. Or it could be an NGO person who's working on behalf of government, keeping these things up to date. So when the coordinating committee meets every 6 months, it's got an up-to-date version of the implementation plans. That seems to work quite well as a way of keeping the action plans up to date. You've got a hard copy, which is the background detail, which doesn't change very much. It could be for 5 or probably 10 years. And then you've got these implementation plans which can change as and when necessary, as long as you keep track of the versions.
And I think some of you are open standards trained, and one of the great assets or plus points around the open standards approach is it links into more of a kind of project management approach, and so there is a way of doing that. I think some may feel that it gets quite complex, and sometimes again you're making a trade-off, and the sort of Excel sheet that is in the folder that Simon sent, it's called a monitoring tool or whatever it is that we're trialing at the moment, and I think Caroline would have introduced, or I mentioned in one of the talks, are sort of simpler ways of trying to just keep track of actions being implemented, when when they should have been implemented. I think probably there's value in going to an extra level and saying how important are these actions, and I can't remember now whether within yours it does relate to that, because it can be quite easy to do certain actions like get some protocols written, or the document side can often be a thing make you feel as if we're getting through the actions, and actually the big stuff are the things that stay sort of sat on the shelf. They're harder to deal with. Have you had experience with that?
Yes, no question that some of those easy things can be ticked off. It's not completely black and white on that, I would say, Jamie, because I think having some relatively easy actions which can be ticked off quite quickly, even if they aren't, as you suggest, likely to be the ones which have most impact, does have the effect of boosting morale. When you have the 6 monthly reviews, to actually be able to say that this, this, and this were done is, rather than nothing was done, is obviously much more encouraging. But one obviously has to recognise that we need the important things done. And so on those examples in the folder, there's a way of highlighting priorities. And so the things which are most likely to have impact can be given a high priority rating. And so it should be fairly easy to see that it's the low priority stuff which is being knocked off, and the high priority stuff is not, because of the challenging nature. And so a sensible oversight committee should be able to identify that problem fairly readily and encourage people to actually focus on the things which are going to make a real difference for the species in different places in the country. There's an element of common sense about it, but one shouldn't minimise the morale boosting side of ticking some stuff off, even if it's only relatively easy stuff. A related thought on that, just quickly, is one of the mistakes I think people sometimes make in workshops developing action plans is to try and do some of the stuff which could actually be better listed as an action in the action plan. You know, if there's absolutely no information whatsoever about the species in the country, or it's massively out of date, and there isn't time to do a status review for the workshop, then one action could be in the action plan to do a status review as soon as possible, rather than obviously you have to have some idea of where the species is before you can, and how many are left before you can develop an action plan. But if the data are very, very poor, an action can be to do a status review straight away, or do a national assessment of the status of the species. Don't necessarily try to do it in the workshop if you can actually list it as an action for the following months.
That's superb. And Simon, just one last point before we wrap up, which is from Sally. And it's just saying, so with this living document, do you then share that with everybody, or is that something that would, within your example, will that sit within a smaller group to have access to?
In the examples we're talking about in Malaysia and Myanmar, the NGOs working on elephants get access to those spreadsheets. There's no real kind of confidential information in them, but I imagine it will vary from circumstance to circumstance, and from country to country, and will depend on how open the government feels it can be about certain information and so on, which might of course depend on the threats of the species and so on. If it's a very high value species whose location you don't want publicised, a rare orchid or something, then it might make sense to redact some of the information. But as a general principle, I think you want to try and encourage people to feel they own the process, that they're part of the process, that their actions are being monitored and taken seriously, and when they do something, it's being recognised. So sharing as much as possible, subject to common sense restrictions on data availability and risks associated with that, it does generally make sense to allow the organisations which are implementing the plan to have access to the latest version of the implementation plan.
Simon, thank you very much indeed for some really insightful thoughts, and great to be able to look at it through a live case study, and a nice way to finish the last of the official webinars from the course. I hope the rest of you enjoy the rest of the material, and that you haven't found the whole course of value. As well, as I say, be sending a link round to a feedback on the course, which is going to help us refine it and improve it for the next time we run it. I will also be contacting you to see if there might be value in trying to develop perhaps on a monthly or 2 monthly process, have a different sorts of webinars on different topics that just help and get us thinking, invest in ourselves a little bit as we are developing as planners. I hope that some of you think about going for that certificate of competence and reflective practice, and basically keep the relationship going with us, and we can work with you over an extended period of time. So look after yourselves, enjoy the material. It will be open until the end of the first week of November. And Simon, thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome, and thank you all for taking part.